Art is a valuable part of our community. And while we do enjoy the aesthetics, there's also a real political dimension to art, especially here on Guam, where arts and Chamorro identity are strongly interlinked. Born in Hafade, Guahu Sipulan, and today we have a renowned Guam artist and community mover who will talk about her experiences with the art scene on Guam. She grew up in Inarajan, has many artistic pieces all over the island, was part of CAHA, was part of FESTPAC task force, and she is a very well-known figure in the community here on Guam. And she could do her explaining of her life story herself. She is no other than Judy Flores, or Dr. Flores. Buenos and half a day, Dr. Flores. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, Pulin, for inviting me to join you here.
Yeah. So again, before we get right into the topic of art, do you mind just giving a little information about yourself, such as, where were you born? How did you end up on Guam? And, where'd you graduate from high school, who your parents are, and so on, the basic background information.
Okay. I have to start this way because this is the way I was taught to do it in Inarajan. Naano si Judy Flores. Si nanaho no sinanahoan si tatao man maestro kinlogo y pesmasagado then y familian Flores, familian Apo, si Juan Napati Flores, no, asagwa. Okay, that's enough of my Chamorro. But but I just you give your roots, and having grown up on Guam, my roots are more deeply sunk in the sands of Inarajan than in Colorado, where I was actually born. My father was a teacher in a small town in the mountains of Colorado. And he always wanted to travel. On a teacher's salary, you just don't travel. So we were trying to ranch, he was trying to make a living teaching. But he, in a teacher's magazine, a little small article in about 1957, caught his attention, and they were hiring teachers to come to Guam on contract. And none of us had ever heard of Guam. It sounded exotic. I don't know how he convinced my mom to to make this move, but he had the wanderlust, and there were 6 of us. There was 4 kids and my parents, and we took this long trip to get to Guam, and basically we've been here ever since. It just was. I think the fortunate thing for us was that we were put into, we were the first teachers to be placed in the village. Before they would keep teachers in kind of a compound all together, But we were the first family to be asked to live in the village of Inarajan. So for the first couple of years, we were the only white kids running around. I was the oldest of 4, and I was 11. And it was just such a magical place for me to grow up, because I came from the mountains of Colorado, where it was cold a lot of the times, and even then I was cold. I didn't like the cold. So this was tropical, and the people were so friendly. I had never met people who were so friendly. And my first day of school, my classmates just embraced me, and I felt very much at home. So I'm thankful for that. So I was drawn into the culture right away. When I was, and you can relate to this because I know you've gone on the journey of learning Chamorro, and you're doing very well. And I had to learn it by fire, because everybody spoke Chamorro around me, and they would ask me a question, and they're testing me, to see if I knew what they were saying, or they'd teach me all the bad words first. That's the way it went in those days. But I I started picking up the words. I listened. I was immersed in the language. I had no choice. And every now and then they'd stop speaking in Chamorro and say, "Isn't that right, Judy?" And of course, I knew half of what they were saying, but I went along with it. And more I learned. And then when I started speaking, of course, everything came out wrong because I didn't have the same tongue as the Chamorro language was used to speaking. So it came out funny, and then people laughed at me, and I didn't like being laughed at. So I just stopped trying to speak, and I just listened. And I did that for probably 10 years. I did not speak Chamorro. I listened, and I practiced to myself. And then when I was ready to marry my husband, we had a traditional Chamorro wedding. My mother-in-law was, she didn't speak much English. And when we got married, I thought, this is really embarrassing. It's disrespectful if I don't speak to her in her language. Well, by that time, I could pretty much speak Chamorro because I had been practicing all those years. And it just took that leap, just to start saying it. So at about age 18, I started speaking Chamorro. And being the oldest, it was funny. And because you like linguistics, I'll go into this a little bit. I was the oldest. I was 11. I listened and I learned. My brother was 2 years younger than me. He still lives in Inarajan. He could understand, but he never learned to speak. My sister, who was 6, was just copied it, just parroted everything she heard, and she could speak faster than anybody because she didn't mind practicing in front of people and just, she wasn't mamalo like me, embarrassed. And then my youngest sister, who was 5 at the time, she didn't go to school yet, so she was cared for by the Diego family, who were our landlords. Excuse me. And they wanted their kids to speak English, so they didn't speak Chamorro to her. So she never learned to speak Chamorro. So it was almost like opposite of the way linguistics usually goes. The youngest one would pick it up really fast, but it didn't go that way for us. And what was interesting, as those years growing up in Inarajan, was that I saw the beginning of the demise of the Chamorro language, because like my sister, families wanted their kids to speak English. So in that generation, they started speaking English to their babies. And so I saw that generation grow up with very little. They could understand Chamorro, but they weren't expected to know how to speak it, so they never did. And then their children, of course, were always speaking English too, and it just went that fast. So growing up, I was kind of an anomaly, being able to speak Chamorro. And I could do a lot of eavesdropping and hear things that they didn't know that I heard, but I just kept quiet. But anyway, it was interesting dynamics, very interesting dynamics growing up in Inarajan. Generally, of course, people, as now, they're very fun-loving. They like to make jokes. So I went through all of that, but it was a wonderful place to grow up. And I learned so much about the culture. I finished school in Iran, junior high. I went from 6th grade and then rode the bus to GW once I reached 9th grade. That was a good, almost an hour's ride every day to George Washington High School. But it was kind of fun on the bus. We all had fun riding the bus. And then when I graduated from GW High School, which actually the high school itself blew down in Typhoon Karen when I was a freshman. It used to be located in Mighty, where the Gura housing is now located. There were elephant Quonsets there left over from Navy supply or whatever. So that was our GW high school. We had to walk from one elephant Quonset to the other, probably a mile, when we changed classes. Typhoon Karen came in 1963. I was a freshman, and that was a very scary time to be in the village with a super typhoon. But basically, my school blew down. It was just gone. So we went through double sessions with JFK High School that had just been built, so it was new. So I went to afternoon sessions. The GW students went in the afternoon, and the JFK students went in the morning. So I graduated from GW, but it was located at JFK High School. Kind of a long bus ride from Inarajan. So I graduated in 1964, and I got a scholarship. I was one of the merit scholars, so I was given free college education. Every year they would give 10 merit scholarships. So I was very fortunate to have that. That same year I got married. So I was a young wife, going to college, living in Inarajan. And again, the long ride from Inarajan to UOG, which was a new campus where it is located now. There were just two buildings, Building A and Building B, which are still there. I went into art. I wanted to be an art teacher. I told my mother, as I was thinking about, getting close to graduating from high school, I said, I want to be an artist. And my mother was worried. How can she make money as an artist, So she very tactfully said, well, why don't you go get be an art teacher? Then you can always do that. Well, I listened to my mother, so I was an art teacher, and I appreciate that. But I'm glad I proved her wrong. I had a great art education. It was very simple because we didn't have a whole variety of media, but from Mrs. Pauline Harvey, she was retiring soon. She was an excellent teacher. For what I learned from her, I was able to teach my art students for many years. She gave us a practicum that just worked. So I was an art teacher for several years. My husband got stationed. He was in the Navy, and in 1968 he got transferred to Seattle, Washington. We had one child, so I traveled ahead of time so that I could check into college, transferred, and the credits and the scholarship did transfer. So that was very fortunate. I went to University of Washington for 4 years. For 2 years, because I got my BA in art at University. It was College of Guam. It wasn't even University of Guam at the time. So I went to University of Washington and got my master's in 2 years, 1970. Yeah, 1970 is when I got my master's. Yeah. And then in 1970, I had our second child. Then my husband was stationed in San Diego on a ship. So again, we traveled down to San Diego, drove down there. And I tried looking for work in the educational field, couldn't find anything. So I ended up working at a hobby shop. just a retail shop. It was a nice experience. San Diego was a lot of fun. There were a lot of CHamoros there. But this was the time of the Vietnam War. And my husband, we decided he volunteered to go to Vietnam for the reason that we wanted to go back to Guam to make our home there. So the only way he could really do that was to send us to Guam. And he volunteered for Vietnam. It was a big sacrifice for him, but he made it through. I went back to Inarajan, and I taught, I taught art. It was interesting because my degree at the University of Washington was home economics. And I had chosen that because I had tried art as a practicum teacher. I decided I'd rather work with the girls. The boys are kind of too rambunctious, and so that was very, I was young. I made decisions in strange ways, but I came back and ended up teaching art, and I taught art for 10 years. Loved it. During that time, I was just involved in the community, doing things for the community and the church. And then I was, of course, interested in the culture. I could speak CHamoru. And I started writing grants to do small projects. And so I became a grant writer just by writing grants and being awarded grants. And at that time, I was also starting my art career. I was looking for places to display my art. I was, while teaching art, I had discovered batik, and I just decided that was the medium for me. It just worked for the cultural subjects and things that I wanted to do. So I've been doing batik since 1972. I had read about it in a magazine and tried it out and liked it. So I had set up my art room at Inarajan Junior High, and then it became a high school. I had set it up with the big pots of dye and all of that because I didn't have room at home. And the traditional way of doing batik was you had to have these big pots of dye, and it was messy. So at lunchtime, I would have a quick lunch and then go do my batiks in my room. And kids would walk by, and they'd smell the wax melting, and some of them liked it and some of them said, ooh. But they were curious. So those who wanted to come in, I let them come in and watch. And out of that, I got some interested students. So we kind of had an art club where I taught batik. So those, I had the same students through the 3-year period from the 7th grade up to the 9th grade. And I had some really talented students, and we did large murals that we showed off at crafts fairs. And it was an exciting time for the arts, because before that, there were no outlets to sell our art. So the university was very instrumental. They had some really young, dynamic teachers who started having art fairs and organizing art fairs. So we had those, and I involved my students in that, and we did a lot of exciting art projects. I started a art development program soon after I quit teaching regular art. I loved the classroom, but I just felt like, do I want to do just classroom work, or do I want to extend further? And I decided that let me ease myself out of this situation. So while I was still teaching, I started, I worked at a plan with the new Cocos Island development people when they first started developing Cocos Island. I offered to bring students out there, and we would do demonstrations of batik and printmaking for the tourists who would come to Cocos Island for the day. And so I would choose 2 students from the class and arrange for, it started out, I had another teacher come in who would teach the students that day, and I would go to Cocos Island with the students. So that was really exciting because, you know, the kids got to ride the glass bottom boat and spend the day out there at the beach, basically, doing their art. And that grew into a more developed program where I worked with, I got out of the classroom and started coming into Inarajan art classes and Ocean View art classes, and expanded that way so that I would give the teacher a chance to take selected students out to Cocos Island, and I would teach that teacher's class. So this went on for probably about 5 years, and it developed. I was trying to develop it so that other teachers could take over and I could do other things. That seems to be the way I try to do things, is develop it and give it to somebody else so that I can develop something else. Doesn't always work that way, but I try. So let's see, where did it go from there? We actually developed it to where we had all the high schools on the island, and they would come to my studio at Inarajan, where I live now, and learn from me while teachers would take turns. Eventually the Cocos Island thing stopped. They folded, but they did other things, so that we had this whole network of art students learning batik, and they were really great years. So I was out of teaching. During that time, I ended up working for the legislature. I didn't even realize that Senator Gefpa'go was asking me to work for her. She took me to lunch and she said, you know, and finally, I just didn't get it. I didn't know what she wanted. And she finally said, Judy, I want to hire you to write the legislation for, to create a Guam Arts Council. Because up to that time, we didn't have a Guam Arts Council. We had an entity out of the governor's office called the Insular Arts Council. And they did basically the same thing, but they were very small and they weren't an agency. So I looked at the legislation that had been done in other places, put it together, ran it past several people to see if it was what we wanted. And then when we got it shaped the way we wanted, we took it to the legislature and eventually got the bill passed to create the Council on the Arts and Humanities Agency. So that, when did that happen? I think that was early 80s, 82, I believe. So I only worked 1 year for the legislature. But I really, in that experience, I really learned a lot of respect for our senators. The senators that I worked with and I associated with were very dedicated, and they spend a lot of hours, and I'm sure it's the same way it is now. They get a lot of flack because in politics, you can't please everybody, ever. But anyway, it was a great learning experience for me. But I didn't want to go into politics. I preferred art. So about that time, I continued to pursue my own art career, selling in small little gift shops and so forth on consignment. And then we had just started an artist cooperative. There was a new shop that opened that was meant to be a consignment gallery, and it was called Colorful Creations. And that started, I believe, in 1985. And it was the first of its kind in Guam, a consignment gallery that just, it was supposed to be an artist co-op where artists would take turns minding the shop, and we would sell everybody's art. Well, we soon found out, and the owner soon found out, Karen Klein was here for many years, and she started that. And she was a very good business-minded person. And she realized that our heart was not in running a business, and she better get in there and run a business because we weren't very good at selling. But she continued, and she continued to be a wonderful outlet for artist sales. That launched my first big commission. And I'll always remember that. I was minding the store that day, and Dr. Erickson and Dr. Perez from the doctors, they were just opening Doctor's Clinic. And they walked in and they said, Judy, we want you to decorate our clinic. We want you to put all your art to do our clinic. That is an artist's dream, I'm telling you, in 1985. So I put together a proposal. I looked at what they wanted, and ended up doing 2 18-foot murals of overlapping pieces of batik, one on each side of, one for Dr. Erickson's side and one for Dr. Perez's side, and then several big hangings and some large framed pieces. Some of those are still there, amazingly. So that was my first big commission, and I think I would have been happy continuing to do my art, but opportunities kept coming up, and the Arts Council was now an agency of the government of Guam, and they had just started a folk arts program, and there was a vacancy for the folk arts coordinator, and I looked at the requirements, and they wanted somebody who could speak CHamoru. They wanted somebody who could write grants, and I could do both of those things. So having a master's degree didn't hurt it, but it wasn't directly related to it, you know. But I got my job at the Arts Council in, what year was that? 1980s, around 1985, I believe. Yeah. So I developed the program, the folk arts program for the Arts Council. I loved my job. I had a great boss. Tony Lamarena was my boss. He was a hands-off person who believed in having his staff take a project and run with it, but he was always there to help, to support. And we were a great team. Paula Bomba, who's now she's now with retirement. She's the director of retirement. But we just had a really good, close-knit group of people. And I worked there for 10 years. During that time, we started all of those things that are going on now. FESTPAC started. The first time that Guam officially entered the Festival of Pacific Arts was 1984. It turned out to be 1985 in Tahiti. But before that, it was out of the governor's office, and they would just appoint maybe 1 or 2 people or a small group to represent Guam, because we weren't officially a member of the SPC, the South Pacific Commission, who organizes FESTPAC. So 1985 was the first time that we went as a group. My first trip was in 1988. Before this, the focus of the people of Guam was always on the mainland, the US mainland, even when you say that word, mainland, as if we're a part of them more than they think we are. Everybody wanted to go to the States. They wanted to see Los Angeles and Disneyland and Universal Studios and all of those great things in the States. Nobody was interested in going to the islands. And then when FESTPAC came along, and people that went realized what a rich experience it was to go and connect with people that actually made sense with your psyche. They could see that they were related, although they had lost so much. They could see that, hey, we're one of you. And it took a long time for, if you see my thesis, the other islands didn't think Guam was still an islander. I mean, the people were too westernized. They couldn't see us as part of them. And until that time, we couldn't see us as part of them either. But it just took one or two festivals when people just realized that, wow, they can carve. They'd had this little exposure to their ancient culture, and then they went and they found all these people who had a solid connection to their ancient culture, and they were hungry for it. So we just had a proliferation of carvers, and we hadn't lost our weaving and the utilitarian type things, but the aesthetic arts like carving and dancing and things like that, we'd lost it all. Canoe building. Now the big thing is slinging. We're starting to absorb that again. So FESTPAC had that influence, and it continues. It really continues. Our mark of being islanders again, and our pride was that we had everybody come see us in 2016, and that was such an accomplishment for Guam. It was a real accomplishment because we were able to pull it off. And I can tell you, as being part of the organizing force for that one, it was the artists that pulled it off. We didn't get much government help, but the artists just knew that we had to do it right. We had to do it as islanders, and they did. And then the community came out. We had a lot of community support. So we are once again islanders. Isn't it wonderful? I have to go back a little bit and explain that when I was growing up, there was nothing of this. CHamoru dance was the batsu, the soltis, the Spanish dances that were adapted and Chamorroized, but they were Spanish dances. The ancient period had been forgotten, literally forgotten. I remember my son's kindergarten teacher, who was from Inarajan. She said, when my husband used to mow, her husband was a statesider. She said he used to find these stones, the sling stones. He used to find them when he was cutting grass, and he would put them on the windowsill. And I always wondered, why was he saving those stones? That was the degree of loss. That generation didn't even know what sling stones were. Of course, laddie stones were around, but people were kind of afraid of them. They respected them, and they didn't feel comfortable being around them. So So it was a very different time. So I grew up not, like the rest of my classmates, not knowing anything about ancient Chamorro history or anything. As I went into college, and started studying, and even in my first master's, even at the University of Washington, I had to go down to the reserves and find whatever I could on Guam just to do the research. And it turned, the only thing I could find was Laura Thompson's Guam and Its People, so that was the first time I ever read that. And then I started going into other things, the archaeology, the things that are so basic now, but they just weren't available. So through my college years, I learned more and more about the ancient people, and then as I explained in my thesis, in the 1970s, the power movements, the indigenous movements were starting in the States, and they spread to Guam, the brown power, the black power, those kind of things. And then people started, to give you an example, when I was growing up, everybody liked my nose because it was long, and they liked white skin, and those were the ideals of beauty. And then when this brown movement started, and indigenous pride started showing up here in the 60s and the 70s, I remember teaching in the 1970s when kids started calling each other brown. Hey, brown. And that was new. You would never do that before. That was new. Hey, brown. And they were becoming proud of who they were. So that began, from those movements, the international, or at least the US movements, and others. Then people were going off island for their education. Once the 1970s came, and after 1962, when they opened up Guam and people could travel freely without the security restriction. I remember when my husband, who was in the US Navy, we wanted to extend his tour here before we ever left. So we had to go see a psychiatrist. We had to go see the Navy psychiatrist. And he kind of laughed too. He says, I know this is silly. I can see why you want to stay here, but this is what we have to do. Make sure you're okay to stay on Guam. So it was just a very different time. But anyway, like the interviews I did for my thesis, Frank Rabone was one of the first people that started introducing ancient Chamorro dance. And he was influenced, as he always gives credit to, Carlos Taitanu, who had gone off island as a young man when most people didn't go off island, I think in the 1930s, and researched and came back with all of this knowledge. So he had taken Frank under his wing, and Frank was learning all these things about his ancient culture that he had never known. So I did those interviews, and then the other influence was when they started building all the hotels and all the construction in Guam, they started digging up ancient remains. And people never thought about it before, but then people started to get incensed because here are our ancient burials being desecrated so that a hotel could go up or a building could go up, and they weren't paying any attention. They put the bones in a box, and they're still in boxes in warehouses. So people became interested in their past and in the archaeology of the area. There was actually an archaeology program at the University of Guam introduced in the 1970s, and there were several Chamorro young men who had gone through that. Al Lizama was one of the people that I interviewed, and he ended up working with Parks and Rec because of his experience there. And they were the ones that did the excavations for the Ipao band shell, where they found what they called the Princess of Ipao. And that was one of the most major finds of the ancient Chamorro culture, was this grave they found of a woman who, they called her a princess because she had all this spondylus displayed on her body, on her forehead, across her chest, on her belt. It would have been on fibers. They could see the rings going down like an apron. Just she was a princess. That's all they could say, you know. And buried beside her were two people that they considered warriors, because they looked as if they were protecting her. So this was found in the 1970s. So all of these things started to get people to thinking, you know, about we existed before the Spanish. And that's an actual exclamation that dawned on Frank Rabones. We existed before the Spanish. You know, we had, so what did we have? So he started reinventing, reconstructing, and he will always say, I'm not authenticating, I'm just reconstructing based on the lifestyles that we've been able to study through historical documents and through archaeology. I'm just trying to reinvent the way our people must have lived before recorded time. So all of these things came together in the 70s and the 80s, and then I started my research. Of course, I've been a folk arts coordinator since 1985, and I started looking at all of these things that were happening. I saw Frank Rabone in his early stages of creating Chamorro dance, and it was exciting because the first thing he created was the stick dance, which is, you know, jumping and flashing of sticks, and it's a warrior's dance, and you could never get a guy to do Chamorro dance before that. But boy, little boys wanted to hit sticks and jump in the air, and he excited them. You know, he really excited them. So that was one of the programs that I helped start when I was at CAHA. Was Frank Rabone wanted to teach this, and the teachers needed it in the schools. So for years, we funded his artisan education program. He worked his tail off. They would give him 300 students at a time, and he could do it. And he would put on these wonderful shows, and that's how it started. So it was an exciting time, very exciting time. Well, what I think is so amazing is that there are already 2 generations of kids that just take ancient Chamorro dance for granted. They've always had it. They didn't know that we lost it. You know, they're in an entirely different world. Thank God, they can now embrace their culture. And I think a lot of them take it for granted. But I think as all of us, as we get older, we appreciate the past a lot more. When I started doing my Micronesian Studies program, I started reading, you know, the basic literature, and there was one that came out, new forms of archaeology or something like that. Anyway, the archaeologists of that time were saying Guam is too corrupted, too westernized. It's not worth doing field work on Guam. Go to Micronesia. And I thought, I grew up in a very interesting culture, and I'm going to study Guam. So I was determined to do it, and that's how it started. So interviewing all of these people, all of these young men who were just, if you want to see some really intimate interviews go back to my master's thesis, which is probably there, because I did the whole full-length interviews with these young men who were convinced that they were given these objects to take care of because they'd walk down a path and it would be there. And they couldn't just leave it there. They had to take care of it. So that was the feeling of the time. You know, you collected these artifacts because they were given to you and you had to take care of them. So it wasn't to make money. It was to take care of your heritage. So that was what led me to study art, and art in the broad sense of what people made, what were the manufactured, and the dances and the songs and those kind of things. It was a wonderful historical journey. And of course, part of my job as a folk arts coordinator was to first identify the artists. So I got to go out in the field a lot and interview the artists, get to know them. And most of these are the Manamko. And I just love that job. You know, they're just so wonderful to work with. So I would document the artists. I mean, I would identify them, document their art. And during that time, there was a TV programs, TV magazine programs were popular. Tom Unchuk he still works for the legislature, but he had his own agency where he would every week produce a half-hour TV show about something of interest in Guam. So I thought, he needs material and I have material, I need exposure. So we teamed up, and every time we were going to put on an event or interview an artist or something of interest in the culture, I would call him and he'd do the filming. And then I would have to sit there, because they didn't have digital editing in those days. I would sit there with his brother Mike and go through miles and miles of tape and edit. Literally cut and paste and edit. Those were the days. But anyway, that was part of my job. So we got a lot of wonderful exposure on these TV magazines. And at the same time, I was being trained because the folk arts program was first funded directly from the National Endowment for the Arts. So I was invited to attend the Arts Festival on the Mall, the Smithsonian Arts Festival on the Mall that happened every summer in Washington, D.C., on the big mall. They would turn that into a cultural extravaganza for 2 months between June and July. I think it ended July 4th or before July 4th. So all along that reflecting pool and all around between the Capitol and the Washington Monument were these tents set up with countries and being featured each year. And I was assigned to come and attend that and work as a volunteer. So I'd work in the food tent, or I'd work in, helping to present, or I learned so much about festivals by doing that. And I worked with the great lady named Bess Hawes, who was, gosh, she's a legend in the folk arts field. And then I learned I was introduced to her successors, and created great relationships there. And so got to go to Washington, D.C. every summer and do that. I remember Hawaii was being featured one year, and they brought their horses, their Paniolo cowboys, they do the umo. The parks people hated it because they tore up the mall, the Washington Mall every year. But it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And then the other thing that they asked me to join was the annual folk arts coordinators meeting in the South in the Southwest. We had different areas, and I belonged to the Southwestern states. Guam was part of that. So every June, I would go for a week or two to Logan, Utah, way up in the mountains. I'm telling you, it's still very cold in Logan, Utah in June. I froze. But again, it was just such a wonderful experience meeting with other folk arts coordinators, people from Nevada, Washington State, working with, the Mexican traditions, the American Indian traditions, and here I was the only one. Hawaii sometimes was able to come, but I was one of the few who was from the tropics, promoting the tropical cultures. And so I did that for about 10 years again. And where did I go from there? Yes, I worked for CAHA for 10 years. And then I decided it was time for me to go back to school. During the last few years, from 1990, I believe, around 1990 to 1993, I guess, or 1994, they started the Micronesian Studies program at the University of Guam. And I looked at that program and I said, I need these credentials. I've been working in this field for 10 years or almost 10 years by that time. I need to know, how I can improve, am I doing it right, and all of those things. So I went back to school. Again, my boss was very accommodating. He allowed me to leave a little bit early from work to attend the evening classes at UOG. And my director was, the director of my program was Dr. Don Rubenstein. I just feel so blessed that I had so many wonderful guides that helped me along the way. I thought I could write. I really thought I could write by that time. I'd been doing a lot of writing and publishing. Boy, when Don Rubenstein took my papers, they came back red marked, but boy, did I learn. Yeah, he was a wonderful teacher, and he really helped me with my writing skills. So I was going back to the Micronesian Studies program. I finished that program I wasn't quite finished. I just had to finish. It was another master's program. So I was finished except for writing of the thesis. And the opportunity came up. I was finishing, and Don Rubenstein actually advised me. He said, you need to look for where you'd like to go for your doctorate. And I thought, I'm not thinking of going for a doctorate. But he had planted the seed, and pretty soon I was thinking of going for my doctorate. By that time, my kids were grown up, pretty much grown up. And my husband was retired from the Navy. We were settled. He could travel with me if he so chose. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to go for a doctorate, I want it to be an adventure. I want it to be a journey. So again, Dr. Don Rubenstein had this little pamphlet. He said, I've got this. It's from the University of East Anglia in the UK. They've got a very good program in the arts of Oceania. And they sure did. I applied, I was accepted. And in 1995, I went for my orientation at the Sainsbury Research Unit of the University of East Anglia, which is in northern England. It's about 2 hours north of London. And I spent, off and on, 3 years there, getting my doctorate. It was about an hour north of Cambridge because we would often do seminars and things with the people of Cambridge, the students at Cambridge. So that was a wonderful experience. It was a journey. Often my husband was able to come with me. The other fortunate thing that happened was my son ended up working at the time at Continental Airlines. So he had the parents had flight privileges. So that was another reason that I could go that far distant and go back and forth. So I could be gone for 6 months, go home and make sure everything was still functioning all right at home, and then do a little field work and then come back. So I was able to do that. And I tell you, if you see my thesis at on file at Mark, I dedicated it to my son who gave me wings. So I graduated from the University of East Anglia, SRU, in 1999. Came back to Guam, and the interesting thing was when I left, they needed PhD teachers at the university. No question, they just needed PhDs. By 1999, they had all the PhDs they needed, and there wasn't any job for me. So I looked around for a while, and before I had left, I had started with my experience as a folklorist. I had started the Gefpa'go culture village in Inarajan with the people who were there. We started in 1991. We started forming the organization, and we opened in 1992. I had a wonderful original group of board members who were all from Inarajan. The thing that was fortunate for us in Inarajan was that about 10 years or earlier than that, there had been a folk arts village in Inarajan called Lanchon Antigo, and I had been kind of involved in that. I had helped pick the name for one thing, but it was located behind the church. And Father Divine was the priest at the time, and he started it in around 1972. And it was before tourism really took off, and it just inspired people so much because they started thinking. There were enough of the elders who grew up in a time that my generation didn't relate with, and all the crafters were asked to build their own huts, and they built beautiful huts. The expertise was still there, and they remembered all the things that they used to do as a daily part of their lives. They made soap from lye, and and coconut oil, and they made whiskey. That was something that they insisted that had to be shown. They didn't share it with the tourists, but they distilled whiskey, aguardiente. They had weaving, of course. They had weaving and the making of ketupat and boiling the ketupats for the little rice bags. All the basic things that we had at Gefpa'go later began there. People were, they were refreshed. It was just wonderful for extending the knowledge of the culture one more generation. So that folded in when Father Divine left. I think it folded just before he left, or about the time, around 1988. There just wasn't enough support. There wasn't enough to form a nonprofit organization. That's what he had to do, and to support it, the sustainability just wasn't there. So it folded, but then in 1990, I started approaching the people. I did a survey actually asking them, would you like to do something like Lancho Antigo? And the survey clearly showed that yes, people wanted to do it, but they didn't want it because it didn't work with the church. They didn't want it to be associated on the church property. They felt that it should be along the bayside. So I was able to, at that time, they had just exchanged, the people that lived along the bayside when I was growing up had all moved out. They were exchanged for lots in Malolo where they could build a permanent house. So that area was available, and we were able to build Gefpa'go there. So that was going when I left, and tourism, Lam Lam Tours was very supportive since the beginning, and they're still, except for this pandemic, they're still very interested in supporting things like that. So I left that, and when I came back, they were having problems. They just didn't have the administrative capabilities to sustain it. So I thought, this is where I need to be. And I never did go work at the university. I did some history classes, adjunct classes, but I had found my niche, and in 2000, I first got to start Gefpa'go. I had already gotten grants from GVB and from CAHA. And then when I came back, I decided to tackle one of these large federal grants, the Administration for Native Americans and the NEA itself. And I was able to get grants from both of those, and got us started so that we had money for programming. And in the course of doing the programming, of course, we were building the huts. We were, doing the demonstrations. And Gefpa'go was started officially in 1992. And it's still there, but with the pandemic, I just pray that we can start it again. We can keep it going. Where was I? So I came back, and that's where I ended up working with Gefpa'go. And I left there in 2011. And I had a vision of doing something not just at Gefpa'go, but I wanted to include the historic district, because Inarajan itself is on the historic register. So I wanted to get, people weren't even driving in that back in Inner Road, which was a very busy street when I lived on it, but it was just deserted. I remember one fiesta before I opened up the museum there. A fiesta of all things, and people weren't even there. They were maybe at the church or maybe, at Gefpa'go, but the village wasn't included, and that wasn't right. So I was interested in the George Flores store. I felt that it at the time in 2011, it was still a pretty solid structure. And I wrote to the owners. Uncle George Flores was still living, and his daughter, Doris Flores Brooks, was his administrator. And I wrote to them, and I asked, can I borrow this property? Can I lease it for free? Can you give it to me for 5 years? And let's see what I can do with it. And they did. It wasn't being used. It was, deteriorating. So I started working on that. Again, I got in that I had gotten 4 grants from the ANA, the Administration for Native Americans for Gefpa'go. I thought, now I need to try J. Flores Inc. I need to try it as an individual, my own company. I've never tried that side of things. Let me try. So I wasn't eligible for grants that way. As an individual, I could get small grants. So again, CAHA helped me a lot. GVB helped me a lot. Preservation Trust helped me. We were able to get the grants to open first the museum. We took the bodega, stripped it. I hired Tony Montanonia, who's the Hotnu baker. He's very multi-talented. At that time, I said, I knew he could decorate and he could do all these things. And I said, I want you to help me put this museum together. So he did. And in the course of things, I had learned how to paint, how to make whitewash and paint, the way the way those houses were painted, from my mother-in-law, who used it all the time to paint her flowers, her flower pots and her stones and stuff like that. So I taught him how to make offuk, the whitewash. So he learned from me, and together we put that museum together. I had a lot of things that I had collected over the years, so I used a lot of that. CAHA helped me put together the posters. I used my research from my master's thesis or my PhD thesis to create the text, the story for the museum. Did that, and then put the artifacts together, and some people donated, and we started the museum. Well, a museum by itself is not going to attract much attention, and I knew that. So I started doing Sunday morning, like little produce markets, Sunday morning market. And it took a while. I had to bake my own muffins and find my own fruits for a while, but then people started coming out, and we had some really nice street fairs. About once a month we would have a street fair, and that would invite people. And we had, it was quite a gathering. I have a lot of pictures of those times. But I also realized that we need to get a hotno, because I found a sign that says Flores Bakery, and it was on the back door of this building that I was using. And I thought they must have a hotno around here somewhere, the old domed oven that was used to bake bread. And I was under that assumption for quite a while, and I got a grant to hire the Crisostomo family, headed by Edward Crisostomo at that time, to build a traditional hotno in the little carport area attached to that building. So we had our hotno. And I found out later by interviewing the family that they never really baked the bread there. They had a huge ranch up in Malolo. And that's where the bread was baked, and it was sold down there. So I got that part of the history wrong. But anyway, we ended up with a hotno. And boy, the bread was so good. And that was the anchor of the street fair. Once Tony started making his bread, we had people coming, and they would line up. It wasn't ideal, because think of a museum, and the only thing dividing it from a smoky hotno is the service window. And it was a struggle to keep the merchandise from getting smoky and this displays from getting smoky. And people came into the museum, they were lining up for the bread. So I had lots of people in the museum, but they weren't really looking around at the museum. Some people would, and they'd have school field trips and so forth. But the hotno was the anchor. And I had a deal with Tony that I wanted to train him to take over the Hotno business. I didn't want to be in the Hotno business. So by the 4th year, I had turned that over to him. And he was running the Hotno business, but still we were, working together. By that time, I had been working with the Preservation Trust, hoping that we could get a major grant to redo that house because it was getting more and more dilapidated. I had put a lot of money into just repairing one wall that had fallen down and so forth. I never made money on that project, but it was okay because I made money on my art. So it was okay. But I realized we couldn't continue that way. And I worried about the liability. And then it was the decision was kind of taken out of my hands because Doris Brooks approached me. Her father had died by that time. And she approached me and she said, Judy, we're willing to sell this to the Preservation Trust. And it's not the money. She just couldn't see any of the family wanting to live down there and take the attention that property needed. She liked what we had been doing. She said, you've created a memory of my father. And she wanted to sell it to the trust. So the trust now owns that building. So we were trying to get it, some money to get it renovated. I actually did get a grant from GIDA, the federal HUD grant. But as we worked on it, and I had a team with Preservation Trust and other people, the thing that killed that project was the flood zone. Inarajan is on a flood zone, and the FEMA would not fund anything that was on a flood zone unless we paid insurance. The insurance itself was going to be $1,000 a month. So that just killed the project. It just killed the project. So going into our 5th year, I realized that we were fighting an uphill battle. And we loved it, but again, the liability, the trust was worried about the liability. Things could fall on people. We no longer could walk upstairs because it was that dangerous. The floor was not that safe anymore. So we had one more great big street fair, and then the next day we closed. 5 years. So I don't regret any of it. I think the next generation needs to take over. I'm there to advise. I'm there to help. But people need to decide what they want to do with their village. And the historic district is in sad shape. It's there's hardly anything left of what was there when I was growing up, just ruins. So I challenge anyone who has the love and the passion and the willingness to work. There are grants there. There is tourists will come back. Tour companies want to do this. They want to visit places like this. But I gave it my best shot. I gave it 20 years. So I wish the people of Inarajan the best. And what I'm doing now is helping St. Joseph Church celebrate our 340th anniversary. And 2020 was a hard year to celebrate that. But we are doing it. We are doing it. And I'm currently writing the history based on a lot of oral histories that Mr. Bill Polino has been able to keep alive, learning from his parents and interviewing elders and then others that I interviewed. So we think that the commemoration book for 340th Jubilee is going to be something really, really special from this very special village.